Welcome to the video on influence, on specifically change management and getting buy-in. Basically, what we're addressing today is the frustration, the difficulty that you get from resistance, delays, indifference, even from just trying to introduce something positive into the company. So sustainability work certainly fits into this category, even though you know the change is necessary, but getting on board feels like it's an uphill battle. So just so you know, getting buy-in isn't just about the right idea, it's about influencing others to believe in it. So today we're going to break down the first principles behind influence with a framework that you can use for a reference to drive that internal change. And to clarify, what we mean by change management in your company is where you've reached a point where existing behaviors and processes have transformed into new desired outcomes because your processes and your way of doing things are different now. You've hit a point where you're like, you know what, we're going to go left. We'll take the red pill. Cool. So diving into this, there are 6 principles that you must absolutely have when doing this. It'll help you prepare. So the first one is to build people credibility. And what we mean by that is where people follow leaders they trust and who demonstrate expertise. So show your team you've already started reducing your own carbon footprint. You're essentially leading by example. And unfortunately, failing to do the little things will undermine any talk about the big things. It just won't feel sincere. So you need to build that credibility by doing a lot of those things yourself and showing that you understand at least a bit more about the topic. Which leads us to number 2. We're still on preparation, by the way, for influence. So number 2 is to know your audience. Your influence is personal. So you need to understand what motivates or frustrates your stakeholders. So what we typically do here is to empathy map our audience. So who are our social champions? Who are the biggest resistors? Who's neutral? And you want to tailor your communication to each group. So using logic for those analytical minds, you might want to use stories for emotional engagement, the people who resonate that way, and clear outcomes for action-oriented individuals. So you know who to talk to with which kind of tool or which kind of communication style. Now we'll cover this in a bit more detail in this video, actually. And that leads us to number 3. So thankfully, moving on from preparation and now into sort of the doing phase of change management, you're talking about show and tell. So people are more likely to follow when they see change working in practice. So start with small pilot projects or quick wins to demonstrate success. And you want to highlight visible examples of team members benefiting from that change where they say, wow, that was really helpful. I wish I started this earlier. So for example, one of our clients introduced an energy saving system in one department. And when the savings were clearly visible, like the finance team saw it, it was so much easier to scale that company wide. It becomes so much more straightforward with a show and tell approach. Some people think that you quietly do this work, which is fine, kind of like the rapid approach that we talked about earlier in the strategy and road mapping piece, but it doesn't always serve you, so it does help to communicate that. And then number 4, do you want to engage and involve others? So people support what they help create. So involve those employees early on in the process, especially in areas where they'll feel the most impact. So workshops or focus groups are great ways to actually co-create some of those solutions. So one way we've been able to get ownership is ensure meetings are only workshops. So that's something that we've done. So you debate or you work plan or you reorganize during those sessions, but there's no meetings for the sake of meetings. So when people come in and they co-create, they go, wow, every meeting seems to be moving towards something. There's some level of progress. And this has made sure everyone contributes or at minimum speaks up, because when the meeting is a workshop format, everyone gets involved. And they start feeling eventually that their presence means something, assuming there's good leadership and everyone feels included in the process. Number 5, you want to communicate why with nuance. This is almost 2 things, but we've sort of talked about communicate in number 3 and number 4. This is really more about the nuance piece. So on a simple note, influence thrives when people understand the bigger picture. So you use storytelling to connect the change to company values, market trends, your customer needs. So all those elements are important. And because sustainability work requires iteration, the nuance helps people think like scientists. And they start learning from their failure as opposed to, say, toddlers, and throw the whole toy at the wall because one of the pieces fell off. Right? And that does happen. People do aim for perfectionism and end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's a lot of metaphor in a minute. But essentially, when you bring that nuance, it starts helping people think like adults in the room, like scientists, and consider, well, what made that fail? What can we do better? Or what do we need to change? So this means we make the messaging consistent and we repeat it across multiple channels. So keeping it simple with a level of nuance, and then share that across the different places that you need to. And leaders, both in the formal structure and in social structures. And what we mean by formal structure is they have like a legitimate title, they're a genuine supervisor or a team leader. But social structures are maybe in a group, you might have one person who speaks up more than the rest, or is clearly like the gang in a group. You want to make sure that you have leaders in both of those structures at the company that can drive that message. And lastly, number 6, you want to make sure that you have empathy across that chain at all times, because without it, you don't really know when you need to iterate your message or swap from one message to another, because ultimately all of this is about changing other people's behavior. So without empathy, you don't even know if it's working or not. So here's one pathway that we typically use. You've got a design phase, you communicate, right? So that was points number 1, number 2. And then you do, that was points 3, 4, 5. And then after that, you are standardizing what has changed. And then you do monitoring, evaluation, and accountability and learning in order to continually improve that process. So this really should be a loop, but that's generally how this works. And coming back to the empathy piece, it teaches us that we are not the same. That's why you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes and then choose to believe what they say. So knowing that we're not the same, you need different strategies to gain buy-in from different people. So let's dive into the diffusion of innovation to see how that actually works in a framework. So what we just mentioned earlier was designing, and then the doing bit, and then you standardize, and then you do meal. But we have time for 2 frameworks today. So coming right back to the start of this, at the design phase of influence, we turn to the diffusion of innovations model, which is for me a first principles of change management. We're looking at any given group of people, you're going to have different types of people. You have your innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, and they all exemplify different characteristics. So let's dive into that really briefly, where you've got 2.5% are innovators. So you've got something which is currently existing, and everybody's doing things a certain way, but you got probably less than 3% of people who say, hey, I think things are not so great and they could be better, and I'm willing and able to make that change, and I want to do it. So in a company of like 100 people, you probably have like 3 people that will dive on board the sustainability work, believe in it, and do it, and actually willingly adopt that change and take a whole bunch of action. Phenomenal. But there's not many of them. Then in a bigger group, you've got your early adopters. So these are people who believe in it, but they need a bit more certainty before engaging. So even if you get them, that's only 15 or 16% of your organization. So not a lot. So that's less than 2 out of 10 people. And then you've got this thing called the valley of death, which is where initiatives go to die. Because if it doesn't cross this pathway, then generally this is where initiatives die off. So that's why it's called the valley of death. This is also it's come from the startup world. And then the early majority is people who believe in it. That's why they're on that side of the bell curve, but not as strongly and or not willing or able to change just yet. They need even more certainty before making a change. They get a completely different set of communication tools from there, and timing as well. Because while these guys are working on it, you can let them know that maybe these guys not just yet, because they might build influence against what it is that you're doing. But that depends on how well you know your company. That's why you got to do the whole empathy thing and the whole know your audience first. Late majority, these are people on the other half of the bell curve now. Less willing or able to adopt to change. Likely will need policy to make that happen, where the company says, stop bringing single-use plastic, or you pay a fine to the company, for example. And what I mean by that is, like, at the office, you can't bring, like, I don't know, plastic bottles anymore. You got to bring a canister. Right. At this stage, you'll want to standardize if you haven't already. So talking about standardization, if you've already crossed this part, if you've already got all these people on board, and like half of the people are already doing it and the other half aren't, this is where the leadership goes, it's a bit of a joke. You guys really need to get on board. We're going to turn this into policy. And once it does turn into policy, you still will probably find some laggards, people who are not willing or able to adopt change and are likely to be quite loud about it. So at this stage, they leave, or you ask them to leave if they don't share the same values or are unpredictably providing conflict. You want conflict. Conflict is a good thing when you work out between solution A and B. You find a C, and C turns out to be way better. But you get some laggards who are just not about it and they just want to fight, right? So some first principles here is that you need to know is that that framework is a snapshot and it evolves with time, progress, and effort. And it just tells you roughly where you are. So nice when you're doing reviews strategically and go, actually, where are we in change management in our company? And then you can go, oh, wow, if we're over here, then maybe we could put more of our attention over here now, right? Because if you're over here, you don't want to start targeting people over here next. You want to move across that bell curve. I'm not sure if that was obvious or not, but now it is because I've said it. And the last piece on a diffusion of innovation is that knowing that this is what the organization looked like. Oh, I just said it. Don't put effort in dealing with our laggards. They have no intention of changing unless absolutely forced to. And you want to design that truth into your communication and culture building at the very beginning. So when you start inviting people, you need to make sure you got some scripts ready and jump on ChatGPT for this. To think about scripts that you can say against laggards, like sustainability is a journey, and don't we all agree that this is important for us to work on and we will deal with failure? The question is, in a group, how do we want to deal with that failure? How do we want to deal with loud people that are all against this, right? So you can bring that into the very first meetings. And the last framework for today on the standardized piece, this is just a sample HR policy that we use as a template to give to people to start embedding sustainability and standardization into their performance metrics. So the insights here are to use all the tools at your disposal, and you want to tie the employee journey into this as well, or else people aren't going to do it. They're not incentivized to do so. So you're just sort of hoping that they change from the goodness of their hearts. So here is the 3 R's policy: remind, reward, reparation, where basically if something has happened and they haven't necessarily done it right or done it well, like they're not separating their trash, first step, first policy, kind of like the first 3 strikes rule, you remind them first. And if they do well, you reward them. And if not, then reparation, meaning, well, what are they going to do to fix the problem? Is it going to lead to things like a bit of extra time, overtime that they have to spend to like resolve the issue and actually go down, open up the rubbish and separate the trash again? That's now part of their rule to fix what it is, the issue that they caused. Or is it going to result in a fine? I don't know. It's up to you. So this here is just a sample on a policy that you can work on yourself. So you can take that and use that as a template. Now, if I didn't mention before, that template is going to be in the link to the video. And here's some reflections from people who have done it before. So number 1 is to nurture those relationships. Some have spent months building alliances within department heads before introducing any changes. And people weren't interested until they were framed change as something that would actually make their job easier. A big one is to simplify the message, where one company overwhelmed employees with way too much information. So they simplified it into 3 clear objectives, and just things became so much easier, less thought that everybody else had to do. And number 2 is to celebrate wins. We talk about that all the time because you want people to feel like there's momentum and you're moving across that bell curve. So thank you for watching this part of the video. If you have questions, send me a direct message or put this into the masterminds. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.